Trump lawyers, as they well know, Trump's Department of Justice did it every day. Every federal office in this land does it every day. Many attorney general's offices do it every day. This is very common in our legal system. Secondly, the point the court made, and this is the bad part of this segment, I think we all need to realize that what the judge said is making Trump come and swear under oath does not mean he has to testify. So buckle up. What we're going to get is hours and hours and hours of the Fifth Amendment. He will take the Fifth Amendment. He will say nothing. Let me only slow you down and then have you build on that point, because I think you're referring to in page 4, the judge directly says that the Trump lawyers overlooked the fact that they do have, as you allude to, Senator, quote, the right to refuse to answer questions that may incriminate them, which, again, as you say, may be frustrating to people who want to find the truth. But those are the rules. And if you have a decent Fifth Amendment claim on the grounds that you may incriminate yourself because you are, I guess, doing crime or potentially worried about getting busted for it. And they go on to note, the judge, quote, Eric Trump invoked that right against self-incrimination in response to more than 500 questions during a deposition related to this proceeding, end quote, page 4. It seems like you're referring to that and what the judge sort of signposted. Walk us through that. Yeah, I mean, bottom line is these guys, Ivanka and John Jr. and Trump, are going to take the Fifth Amendment. Now, let me point out, I don't ever recall President Barack Obama taking the Fifth Amendment. I never recall Hillary Clinton taking the Fifth Amendment. So once again, Trump is busting a norm that he's going to be a president who has to take the Fifth Amendment in an investigation into his business affairs. The other thing that's important to remember here is that they actually argued today, Ari, in a weird twist, that the Attorney General, they should be calling them in front of a grand jury. Because as Maya knows, there's a weird twist in the New York law that requires New York to give immunity to a grand jury witness. So you found this weird situation where his lawyers were saying, call us in front of a criminal grand jury, because they knew if that happened, Trump automatically gets a get out of jail card free.
Yeah, you're highlighting, both of you highlighting so many important parts of this ruling. And that was a clever bit of lawyering that failed. Donald Trump might not know about that, but he does have the lawyers to throw everything at the wall. And as you say, that failed. I have to ask you a very, very simple question, Senator, so pardon me for that, but it's sometimes my job around here. Don't most politicians and most parties want to avoid pleading the Fifth, which tells everyone in the country that they are near a crime?
Yeah, and I think even Trump has said, I don't remember, he said so many bizarre things over the years, it's hard for me to have it all on the hard drive, but I think he said only guilty people take the Fifth Amendment. I believe that was a Trump quote at one point in time. So, and once again, Trump's own words, roasted.
Roasted. Maya?
Fried like a broken egg.
Fried egg.
Look, Claire is exactly right, but I think this is the point. You know, in a court of law, while you might not be able to draw an inference of guilt because someone asserts the Fifth, what it certainly tells you, and what everybody can use politically is, but you couldn't explain it without taking the Fifth, meaning you didn't have a way of describing whatever really actually happened in a way that wouldn't make you look guilty. That's what it means. And so that is not a good look. And I think to Claire's point, politically, there are going to be, you can just imagine the campaign ads that can come that just splices up things that Donald Trump has said in the past with the things that have been coming up in his immensely long road to perdition.
Have you ever seen one of those Comedy Central roasts? They're these TV specials where a bunch of comedians get together and roast or make fun of some famous person. And that famous person has to sit there all night on stage in front of an audience and just take it. About a decade ago, in 2011, they held one of these roasts of Donald Trump. And the comedians that night, they were absolutely brutal. They made fun of Trump's hair, his face, his family, his sex life, his allegedly racist business practices. Nothing was off limits. There is not a single joke I can even repeat here because, of course, this is a family show. But there was one thing that the comedians that night were told they could not joke about. One thing that was absolutely off limits. Absolutely no jokes about Donald Trump not being as rich as he says he is. One of the writers for the roast said that was the red line for Trump. Quote, any joke that suggests Trump is not actually as wealthy as he claims to be. The comedian, Anthony Jeselnik, who roasted Trump that night, said, quote, Trump's one rule was don't say I have less money than I say I do. His kids were fair game. His wife was fair game. This, money, net worth, this is Trump's kryptonite. He once sued a reporter for daring to write that Trump was not, in fact, a billionaire. He pursued the case for years. But when Trump sat down for a deposition in that suit and the reporter's lawyers tried to pin him down on how much he was actually worth, Trump testified under oath, quote, my net worth fluctuates and it goes up and down with the markets and with attitudes and with feelings, even my own feelings. Feelings. Donald Trump lost that suit. Hard to believe, I know. But sometimes Donald Trump needs something to back up whatever his feelings are about his net worth. He needs a piece of paper to show a seller so he can buy some real estate, or to a lender to get a loan, or, to the American people so he can get elected president. That's when he turns to something called a statement of financial condition, prepared by his longtime accounting firm, Mazars. This he could hand to a potential lender or seller and say, see, here it is in black and white, prepared by my accountants. I, Donald Trump, am rich. So you can imagine just how Donald Trump felt this week when his longtime accounting firm, Mazars, announced they were quitting and that they were renouncing a decade's worth of statements of financial condition that they had prepared for Trump. Those statements, quote, according to Mazars, should no longer be relied upon. We have come to this conclusion based in part upon the filings made by the New York Attorney General. New York Attorney General Letitia James has been investigating Trump's business practices, in particular, whether he may have fraudulently misrepresented his assets to obtain loans and tax benefits. Trump's accounting firm looked at the evidence she has accumulated thus far and was like, oh, we are out of here. And Donald Trump's reaction to his accounting firm basically saying, we can no longer vouch for Trump being as rich as he says he is, well, it was about what you'd expect. Trump put out what may be the longest, most ranty statement he has ever released since leaving office. And the statement said, I'm paraphrasing here, I swear I'm really rich, even richer than you think. Far from inflating his net worth, Trump claimed that the Mazars statements actually undercounted how rich he is. Ultimately, of course, his statements ends up at Hillary Clinton and why she should probably be put to death. But remember, the main thing here, don't listen to anyone who says Donald Trump is not as rich as he says he is. That is the one thing prohibited, not allowed. And that was just the start of Donald Trump's week, which has really gone from bad to worse. Today, lawyers for Trump and two of his adult children, Don Jr. and Ivanka, appeared in court to argue to a judge why the Trumps should not have to comply with subpoenas from New York Attorney General Letitia James. It did not go well for them. For starters, the judge's clerk had to keep reprimanding Trump's lawyer for interrupting the judge, telling her, quote, counselor, when the judge speaks, you need to stop talking. The judge appeared unimpressed by Trump's lawyers repeatedly bringing up, who else? Hillary Clinton, and asking why Letitia James isn't investigating her. After that performance, it took the judge only a few hours to rule that, yes, Donald Trump Jr., and Ivanka Trump must comply with the subpoenas, which means that all three of them must sit for depositions. with the New York Attorney General about the Trump Organization's business practices. And their testimony could potentially be shared with the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which is conducting a parallel criminal probe. Or they could all just plead the fifth, as Trump's other son, Eric, already did over 500 times when he testified to Letitia James's office. But one thing that is important to understand here is the snowballing nature of Trump's legal and financial predicament. Today's ruling, compelling Trump and his children to testify, is in part a result of Mazars, Trump's accounting firm. It's of Mazars abandoning him earlier this week. In his ruling today, the judge specifically quotes the Mazars letter renouncing all those Trump financial statements. The implication seems to be, yeah, this kind of sketchy thing is exactly why you need to go testify about your business practices. But you know what? Being compelled to testify to the New York Attorney General may not even be the worst thing that has happened to Donald Trump as a result of those dodgy financial statements. As you know, Donald Trump runs a hotel just down the street from the White House. He doesn't own the building itself, though. He leases the building from the federal government under a deal struck back in 2013 before he was president. Like many of his properties recently, the Trump Hotel in D.C. has been losing money. But unlike his other properties, Trump has actually found a lucrative way to get out of that D.C. hotel. He's reportedly found a buyer willing to buy the lease from him for a cool $375 million, which is well over the market rate. And Trump appears to really need that money. Like I said, his properties are losing money. He has hundreds of millions of dollars in debt coming due in the next few years. His primary bank, Deutsche Bank, has said they won't do any more business with him in the future. Oh, and did I mention his accountants just quit? But at least he's got that $375 million deal to sell that D.C. hotel, right? Right? Today, the House Oversight Committee wrote to the federal agency that manages Trump's lease on his hotel and said they should consider canceling the lease. Why? Because his accountants just announced that no one should rely on the financial statements they prepared for Trump, and their financial statements were what Trump submitted to the federal government to get the lease for his hotel. And submitting false financial statements to get the lease would breach the terms of the deal, meaning the government could terminate the lease. And if there's no lease, then Trump can't sell the lease, which means no $375 million. And as if that weren't bad enough news for Trump, the Oversight Committee says it has also obtained parts of Trump's agreement with Deutsche Bank for a $170 million loan to finance the construction of that D.C. hotel. And that loan agreement also relied on, take a guess, at least one of those financial statements from Mazars. And if Trump provided false financial information to Deutsche Bank in order to get that loan, well, in theory, Deutsche Bank could decide the deal is broken and call in repayment of that $170 million loan right now. That's how any normal loan would work, anyway. In other words, thanks to this report from the House Oversight Committee today, not only could Donald Trump potentially lose his ability to sell his D.C. hotel for a handsome profit, he may be on the hook for a giant loan on that very same hotel much sooner than he planned. Today, the Washington Post published a feature on just one strand of that evidence, the thousands of text messages the January 6th investigation has obtained from key players around Trump on January 6th and in the days and weeks leading up to it. Quote, thousands of frantic, ephemeral text messages that might have otherwise been lost to history are now key to piercing together the most vivid and comprehensive picture to date of the events surrounding the chaos at the Capitol. Texts that go all the way back to the day after the election, like this one to Trump's chief of staff from former Trump Energy Secretary Rick Perry previewing what would become one of the attempted strategies to overturn the election. Quote, here's an aggressive strategy. Why can't the states of Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and other Republican-controlled state houses declare this as BS and just send their own electors to vote and have it go to the Supreme Court? Okay, now, Rick Perry. And this is one to Trump's chief of staff from an unidentified member of the far-right House Freedom Caucus just a few days before January 6th. Quote, if POTUS allows this to occur, we're driving a stake in the heart of the federal republic. And texts like those are just the beginning. The Post reports, quote, the committee so far has publicly revealed only a sliver of the thousands of text messages it has received so far. Joining us now is the lead author on that piece, Washington Post congressional correspondent Jacqueline Alemany. And as of today, she is also now an MSNBC contributor. Jackie, thank you for being here. Congratulations on coming to the family. Let's talk about these text messages. So, you note in your reporting today that the committee has only revealed a sliver of the thousands of text messages. How many of those text messages do you believe were provided by former Chief of Staff Mark Meadows?
Yeah, Alex, that's a good question. Mark Meadows has certainly provided the majority of the text messages that the committee has received so far. We believe that number is upwards of 7,000, but Meadows himself provided 4,000 personal text messages, most of which were actually not reviewed by the former president's legal team since they were retrieved from a personal device. Meadows' text messages are really viewed by the select committee investigating the January 6th insurrection as sort of the connective tissue that is really pulling all of the disparate threads about the planning leading up to and on January 6th all together. These text messages, especially throughout the course of our reporting that we pulled together every text that the committee has so far publicly released, is really helping to paint a more vivid picture of what happened, especially since there's been such a chasm between public statements made by GOP lawmakers and Fox News hosts versus the concern and the panic that was communicated and put directly into Mark Meadows' inbox.
Yeah, the releases of these tranches of correspondence, it's like a serialized drama. How is the committee deciding which texts to release publicly and when to release them? I mean, do we have a sense that they're holding on to texts that may be even more explosive in terms of public consumption?
Absolutely. I think the committee is trying to ensure that they have the most blockbuster public hearings possible, and that means holding back some of these text messages. That being said, the trail of breadcrumbs they've left so far in releasing some of Meadows' text messages with people like Jim Jordan, Sean Hannity, and as we reported this morning, Project Veritas president and founder James O'Keefe have been fairly juicy, and they have needed to release those in order to make a persuasive argument to hold Mark Meadows in contempt. A lot of those messages were released in the contempt report that the committee put out a few months ago. We're still waiting on whether or not the DOJ is going to ultimately take up and that contempt referral. But there is a fine line they're sort of straddling to apply public pressure to get people like Sean Hannity to cooperate voluntarily with the committee versus holding back some of these messages and trying to make the splashiest public presentations possible to draw the American public in.
Well, and yet some of the things we have are splashy and explosive and drawing the American public in. I mean, the text message sent to Mark Meadows by Rick Perry a day after the election, which is essentially like a pitch strategy, an aggressive strategy in typical Perry fashion, is misspelled, right? But the strategy he lays out in Texas, hey, have state legislatures and Republican-controlled states send their own electors. That's basically the plan as it was laid out and executed, right? And yesterday we find out that the committee's issued subpoenas to 2 members of the Trump campaign who it says had a role in directing that scheme. I guess I wonder whether you think the committee is ahead of the public reporting we have on that aspect of the campaign, that effectively they know a lot more about what's transpired than we've digested in the press as yet.
I think they do. I think not to toot our own horns, we've done a good job of getting out ahead a lot of these stories before the committee was previously aware of them. But when it comes to the information that they've gathered so far, the volume of these text messages, documents, and records and depositions that they've collected makes it such that there's inevitably going to be some news and some big reveals. I think what's also important to note about these texts, other than the content and some of these crazier and unexpected reactions to things, these frantic, ephemeral concerns that were raised that would have otherwise been lost to history if not for being memorialized in a text message, is the forensic analysis that I believe committee investigators can do of the social networking. Obviously, these text messages show the direct pipeline between the White House and Fox News. They also show some of the relationships that were more personal than potentially we realized. For example, like the fact that Mark Meadows had a texting relationship with James O'Keefe. So that is also helping piece together a lot of these various schemes that were sort of all concurrently going on.
Yeah, it's the first kind of beginning of a fully fleshed out org chart of the Trump universe and this power grid, if you will. Exactly. I got to ask about the news today that the Biden White House is effectively clearing the committee to get access to the Trump the White House visitor logs. What could be in those that might not be in the text and other communications that we've been privy to thus far?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And it's actually, I'm not all that certain that we're going to get that much from these logs just yet, because as our reporting has borne out in the last few weeks, we know that this was a president who subverted, ignored, and failed to follow most procedures. It's unclear if these White House visitors logs were meticulously and accurately kept, or if the president was sort of sneaking past these processes that were implemented for a reason, to document and keep the most comprehensive picture of history in order for the American public to look back and be able to potentially know who was visiting with the president at this crucial juncture in our democracy. But it's unclear if Trump was doing that. On the other side of the coin here, any names that are on there of people going in and out of the White House that we don't already know of will be extremely helpful. We know in those final weeks that the president was trying to overturn the results of the election, there were fringe figures like Michael Flynn, Mike Lindell, Sidney Powell going in and out of the Oval and the White House residence. And I think that at this point, any documents that the committee can get their hands on is a win.
Yeah, I mean, if the president was flushing records down the White House toilet, goodness knows what's happened to those visitor logs. But we await the reporting on all of it. I am sure your byline will be on some important stories in the very near future. Jackie Alemany, Washington Post congressional correspondent and now an MSNBC contributor. Thanks for joining us tonight. Angela McCallum, the Trump campaign staffer you heard making that phone call, she was subpoenaed by the January 6th investigation in November. And now, that language from her call about urging state lawmakers to reclaim their authority, well, that language has now shown up in new subpoenas from the January 6th investigation. This is from a letter accompanying a subpoena to a guy named Mike Roman. Quote, "The Select Committee is in possession of communications reflecting your involvement in a coordinated strategy to contact Republican members of state legislatures in certain states that former President Trump had lost and urge them to reclaim their authority by sending an alternate slate of electors that would support former President Trump. It appears that you helped direct the Trump campaign staffers participating in this effort." And then if you check out the footnotes in the letters, the investigators say they're basing these allegations on, quote, documents in the possession of the Select Committee. In other words, material they have obtained from other witnesses or other subpoenas. And who is this Mike Roman guy who the January 6th investigation believes helped direct Trump campaign staffers in the fake electors scheme? Mike Roman may have actually the perfect resume for someone running a scheme to overturn an election based on false claims of voter fraud, because he was behind what you might call the OG Republican stolen election narrative. Do you remember this video? Back in 2010, this 80-second video clip of a couple guys hanging around outside a Philadelphia polling place was played literally wall-to-wall, nonstop, on the Fox News channel. It was just two guys outside a Philly polling place. But once fed through the Fox News outrage machine, it became evidence of a massive campaign of voter intimidation by radical black activists that was being covered up by the Obama Justice Department. Elections were being stolen for Obama and the Democrats through these shameless voter intimidation tactics. Well, that video, the video that launched 1,000 Fox News careers, that video came from this guy, Mike Roman. And that kind of achievement will get you far in today's Republican Party. By the 2020 election, it really came full circle for Mike Roman. He was on the Trump campaign poll-watching team, spending Election Day accusing Democrats of stealing the election, using as his evidence photos and videos of black voters in Philadelphia. And after that, the January 6th investigation believes, Mike Roman went on to help direct the Trump campaign's fake elector scheme. He is one of several people subpoenaed this week in connection with that scheme, as the investigation appears to be steadily building an org chart of how this plot was carried out.
This morning, yet another disturbing video showing yet another scare in the air. Passengers on board a Delta flight from L.A. to Atlanta pinning a man down after the airline says an off-duty Delta flight attendant tried to take control of the plane's PA system. The captain took to the intercom asking passengers to help.
We'd like all strong males to the front of the aircraft to handle the problem passenger.
Air traffic control then diverted the flight to Oklahoma City Friday night, where police took the passenger into custody. It's just the latest incident involving what the FAA says is a surge in bad behavior in the skies. Earlier this month, another Delta passenger was arrested after reportedly attempting to breach the cockpit. And on this Southwest flight from Sacramento to San Diego in late May, a passenger punched a flight attendant, causing her to lose 2 teeth.
Since the start of the pandemic, incidents involving dangerous passengers on planes have absolutely skyrocketed. This past Sunday, 2 separate American Airlines flights were forced to divert their flight from their flight path because passengers were causing a disturbance. On one of those planes, a passenger tried to open the plane door mid-flight. This uptick of in-flight disturbances has put flight attendants in a terrible spot, essentially turning them into club bouncers who have to mitigate dangerous, often violent, and sometimes drunken situations at 30,000 feet. Airlines often keep lists of these unruly passengers and ban them ever from flying with their airline again. But the issue is nothing is stopping them from hopping on a flight with a different airline and doing all that nonsense all over again. Earlier this month, the CEO of Delta Airlines wrote to the U.S. Attorney General proposing a more permanent solution, one that would prevent unruly passengers from buying airline tickets. He asked for the Justice Department to create a national no-fly list, a list that would be shared among all the airlines and would ban people convicted of dangerous, violent behavior from all flights. It would work the same way as the no-fly list for terrorists. If you're found to have been unruly or violent on an airplane, you would be banned from flying again, not just with that one specific airline, but full stop. And it seemed like kind of a nonpartisan, no-brainer, totally reasonable solution for this problem until a group of Republican senators came out against the plan this week. The fact that this spike in airline disturbances coincides with the pandemic is, of course, not a coincidence. Of the close to 6,000 unruly passenger reports investigated by the FAA last year, 72% of them were because of passengers who refused to wear masks. And that is why these 8 Republican senators are against a no-fly list for unruly airline passengers. They're worried that creating such a list might unfairly liken an anti-masker, many of them Republicans, to a terrorist. The senators write this to the Attorney General, quote, creating a federal no-fly list for unruly passengers who are skeptical of this mandate would seemingly equate them to terrorists who seek to actively take the lives of Americans and perpetrate attacks on the homeland. Joining us now is Sarah Nelson, president of the Association of Flight Attendants. Ms. Nelson, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Alex.
So let's first start with the suggestion of a national no-fly list, one for unruly, I would call dangerous passengers. Does the union support the list, and were you at all involved in the ideation around it if you do support it?
We've actually testified 3 times in the last 6 months before Congress on this very issue, and encouraging DOJ, TSA, FAA to work together to put this list together so that the government can actually control that, communicate that in real time. We can have a transparent process with due process, because a lot of people are concerned about that due process for good reason. But we need to use this as a consequence for people who are acting out on planes. We already have fines. You've heard about the fines from the FAA. That hasn't slowed this down. You've heard that the DOJ has started to prosecute, although we haven't made it all the way through those prosecutions with a conviction and people landing in jail yet. But we have this other option as well. Secretary Buttigieg has said this is on the table, along with all of us. And other airlines are supportive of this too. We need to work together to resolve these issues, to use the threat of losing your ability to fly if you are causing this much problem on a plane, because you are putting everyone at risk when you're doing that. And it's very much like the other no-fly list that we have for a very good reason.
Yeah, I mean, when we call them unruly passengers,